Hello, and welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith. I'm the Ryan half of Ryan and Brian, and this is episode number 52. Today, Brian and I are joined by Dr. John Weatherly of Johnson University. In Season 1, John discussed with us how we should look at the Gospel of Luke. In today's episode, we are discussing the passion narratives in the Gospels and what they reveal to us about Jesus. It is a great conversation. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that you can find us at thebiblebistro.com, on Instagram and Facebook at The Bible Bistro. You can watch us on YouTube as well at Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. If you are watching us there, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. We've also set up a Patreon account, so if you're enjoying the podcast and would like to support our continued work, you can do that. You can find a link for that in the show notes, but also by going to the website, thebiblebistro.com, and clicking on the link at the top. If you can't financially support us, you could also support the Bistro by simply sharing the podcast with others or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. That helps as well. All right, let's jump right into our conversation with John Weatherly. Hey, Brian, welcome back to the Bistro.
Hey, Brian, how's it going?
It's going all right. I'm doing all right. It's a rainy day here in Indianapolis.
Oh, yeah. It's we had beautiful weather yesterday, but they're saying chance of thunderstorms today. So,
oh gosh,
it's a good day though. We have a guest in the Bistro.
Yes, we do.
It's John Weatherly. He's a returning guest. We had him on before. Yes. John, you probably don't know this. I guess you may now, but you probably don't know this. But you were the number one leading downloaded and listened to episode that we've ever had on the podcast.
That is so weird. That is so weird.
Well,
okay.
We're going to have you back. As I said then in that one, I'll encourage you. I'm not going to repeat all this because I want you guys to go back and listen to that first episode we had Dr. Weatherly on. But he was my primary professor in my master's program, taught me a lot about Greek and how to read the New Testament, gave me a lot of good insight, set me on a good direction. Whether or not I've always stayed on that path, I don't know, but he at least started me in the good direction. But anyway, it's good to have John back. We had you back last time to talk about kind of an introduction to Luke Acts, and it was really a useful thing. We're a little more specific this time, though, because we're approaching Easter as we're recording this, a really important time for us as Christians. And so we thought we would have you talk a little bit about some of the passion narratives. But we talked about them before. You're an expert in Luke Acts, but more specifically, you did your PhD thesis at the University of Aberdeen on the Jewish responsibility of the cross in Luke Acts. And so
that's correct. Yeah, I did, which is kind of a provocative title.
Right.
And was self-consciously so.
Okay.
I was responding to a book that was arguing that the portrayal of responsibility it was arguing comprehensively that Luke Acts is anti-Semitic, that it was written to say Jewish people are inherently bad, Gentiles are inherently superior, God loves Gentiles more than he loves Jews. Kind of seeing this as sort of a very, very early impetus to what becomes the anti-Semitism that's in Western culture that, of course, culminates in the final solution and so forth.
Right.
But what I was looking at specifically to respond to that was, does Luke Acts say Jewish people as a group bear responsibility for the death of Jesus? And what I discovered is, no, it's really much more focused than that. There's lots of discussion of Roman engagement, Roman involvement in this. Of course, everybody knows who does the crucifying in the ancient world. You don't need to. So in the Roman Empire, Rome does the crucifying. Everyone knows that.
Right.
But in terms of what about Jewish people? It's a very specifically defined focus, which stands over against a lot of other things that exist in larger Jewish literature. It's the city of Jerusalem. Yeah. So anyway, that took me into a close reading of all of the gospel passion narratives.
Right. And so that's why I think it'd be really interesting to hear what you have to say on that. I'll just go ahead and add, just a lot of our listeners may not realize this, but there's a lot of the books of the New Testament that have this kind of anti-Semitic accusation thrown against it. Gospel of John. which I'm very interested in.
Oh yeah, John is very big in this club. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you have this whole statement in of Jesus saying, you are of your father the devil, which to the quote unquote Jews, and so that's it's one of those kind of areas that maybe as we're thinking about this in church, we don't necessarily notice very often, but it's something that we talk.
It's so true. That's so true. And I say to my students all the time, please watch your language. And I'm talking about this kind of thing. If you want to make friends with your Jewish neighbors and coworkers, please don't talk this way.
Right.
Understand that a Jewish person can use the word Jew in a way that you can't.
Right.
And that's
true.
Very much with due allowance for the passage of time. Very much what's happening in the New Testament, as I know you appreciate.
Right. Well, as I mentioned, that's so your expertise there is really the reason we thought it would be good to talk to you as we're approaching Easter. So I you talked about the close ring of the passion narratives. I thought we might start just by talking about what do we mean when we say passion narrative, or how do you define a passion narrative?
Yeah. That's a great question. Because I always make sure that I say this in class with students when we come to this point in a course that discusses the passion narratives. We call them the passion narratives not because we're saying Jesus has deep feeling about this. Now, obviously he does.
Right.
But passion in English at this point is derived from a Latin expression which means suffering.
Right.
So these are the specific narratives of Jesus' suffering and death. If you've gone to the Passion Conference, understand that the word is maybe being used, with two different meanings there. I don't know. I haven't been to the Passion Conference. I suspect it's much more the strong feeling idea. Strong feelings are great, but here this is how we're using the term.
So we're talking about the events surrounding the suffering of Jesus and his crucifixion is specifically the focus when we talk about the passion narratives. And as you've taught me, I know, and as you've mentioned before, that this is an important part of the Gospels as a whole. The Gospels, in a sense, are kind of focused on this idea of the passion. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, about 100 years ago, a German scholar by the name of Martin Debelius described the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as passion narratives with long introductions. And that's very appropriate. There's a kind of a domestication of Jesus in popular culture, and there are various ways that this happens. We could devote a whole episode to that. Wrong Jesuses, hippie Jesus and pacifist Jesus, and get along. Can't we all get along, Jesus, and all of these kinds of things. The Gospels as books wouldn't exist. The gospel wouldn't exist if Jesus hadn't died by crucifixion in the set of circumstances in which he did. One of the kind of over on the critical scholarship side, not the popular culture side, one of the notions that took root in the 20th century in critical biblical scholarship was the idea that, for example, when Paul preached the gospel, he went into a place and declared, "I have God's good news. Jesus of Nazareth died on the cross for your sins, and God raised him from the dead." Well, if you were to hear a message like that, would you believe it, or would you have questions? And of course you would have questions. It would be, who is this guy?
Right, especially in a context where Jesus is not widely known, right?
Yeah, he's not known at all. And if he's crucified, he must be a criminal. So, we know who crucified people are. They're losers.
Right.
They're criminals. They're insurrectionists specifically. They're trying, and you're saying a crucified guy is king. Well, I've got questions. I've got big questions. And so you've got to tell the story so that you understand why this death isn't just another random act of cruelty done by an empire that does 3 random acts of cruelty every day before breakfast. Okay. And why, if there is this unthinkable resurrection of the dead, why it means something other than just a randomly inexplicable act or some, minor manifestation of a minor tribal deity or something of that nature.
Right.
So in this respect, all of the Gospels are so to speak, foreshadowing the death of Jesus from very, very early on. When you think, for example, I'll begin with Luke. When you think of the way that in the temples, Simeon says to Mary, "A sword will pierce your own soul." Well, if you've read the end of the book, you understand what that's referring to.
Right.
When you're reading Matthew's gospel, Herod is trying to kill Jesus, and of course he doesn't succeed. But you see Jesus in peril in that, and then this sets up this kind of broader question: if Jesus dies at the end of the book, why does he when God protected him at the beginning?
Right.
So obviously God is protecting this guy. Why isn't he protected at the end?
Right.
When we look at this, we see the temptation narrative differently. If you are the Son of God, command these stones to be made bread.
Right.
Well, that's really calling on Jesus to use his divine authority to serve himself. And this is what he never does. Jesus' miraculous authority he exercises only on behalf of those who are in need. He doesn't, when he's challenged to give a sign from heaven.
Right.
He refuses to do that.
Right.
Now, the word sign in John's Gospel is very positive. In the Synoptics, it's always his opponents who are trying to get him to, prove something. So he refuses that. But in saying, no, man does not live by bread alone, but every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, he's reversing what Israel does in complaining to God and in making demands on God and so forth. And so you get what is set up as a kind of an opposite of the Exodus story, but an opposite of the story in the garden as well. Adam and Eve lack divine authority, but grasp after it in rebellion against God to use it for themselves. Jesus has divine authority, but doesn't use it for himself, and instead submits to the care and protection of God the Father. So the temptation narrative, and all three temptations in Matthew and Luke as they're enumerated, are really anti-crosses. They're ways of Jesus coming to, they're ways of Jesus coming into authority, into power in a way that is self-serving rather than self-giving and submissive to the Father. So we're thinking about this. We think about it when Jesus is asked about his eating with tax collectors and sinners.
Right.
And he says, or I'm sorry, not that one. It applies there too, but that's not the one I meant. It's the one that's right next to that in the Synoptics. Why don't your disciples fast like John the Baptist's disciples?
Right.
And like the Pharisees? And the answer is, well, when the bridegroom is present, you don't fast, you feast. And Israel's bridegroom is Yahweh, is God himself. So Jesus is saying something there, right? But then he does this thing that doesn't fit Jewish wedding customs at all. The time will come when the bridegroom is taken away. Then they will fast.
Right.
Now, I read that, you read that, I know the end of the story. I understand he's talking about his death, but he's talking about it in this oblique, indirect way, as he does, that is memorable but obscure and provocative, but kind of goes off like a time bomb. I'm guessing sometime around mid-afternoon on Easter, when a lot of people's heads are getting flat from going like this and so forth. So you get sayings like that. This generation seeks a sign, but no sign will be given it but the sign of Jonah, which in Matthew then gets elaborated as the Son of Man, or as Jonah was 3 days and nights in the belly of the thing that swims, I will say, for those who want to say it's a fish. So the Son of Man will be 3 days and nights in the belly of the earth.
Right.
All of those kinds of things. So all of this is preparation.
It's foreshadowing, right?
Yeah, and then you see this alongside of Jesus teaching with authority. You see this alongside his acting with authority, authority that belongs to God alone. So you may know the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, and he commands the man to walk, and so he does what only God does. He forgives sins. He tells the storm to be quiet, which is exactly what Psalm 107 says that Israel's God does for those who go down to the sea in ships. So
you've talked about foreshadowing at this point. Let's talk about then when we get to the passion narrative itself. Then these stories, as you said, surrounding suffering and Christ dying. Yeah. What are the primary focus there? Do you think? What are the synoptic, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke is what we call the synoptic gospel. What are these gospels trying to tell us in particular? Do you think?
Well, there's a bunch of stuff. First of all, who's in? There's like 8 roads that come together in one complicated intersection.
Okay.
I don't know that there's 8, but let's count how many there are. Okay. And then later we'll count how many we've left out.
Play along at home, kids. So.
Yeah, for next year's Lenten podcast, we'll do all the things we missed in last year's Lenten podcast. So one of the things that's very prominent is the way that these narratives portray Jesus as completely aware of and in control of the circumstances.
Right.
So in the synoptics, there's a kind of a fulcrum, if we all remember our elementary school physics, or if we remember the seesaw on the playground before the safety people took it away. So there's a kind of a tipping point, and it is where Peter confesses Jesus is the Christ. Who do you say that I am? You are you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Matthew is the way most of us remember that.
Right.
Before that point, when Jesus speaks of his death, he does so infrequently and obliquely.
Obliquely, right.
Yeah, like we were saying, the bridegroom will be taken away. You get just a smattering of sayings like that. Immediately after Peter says this, and of course in Matthew, Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. You say what God says." You say what God says. Jesus says, boys, we're going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be handed over. I'm going to be killed. 3 days later, I'm going to rise. And Peter rebukes him.
Right.
And Jesus says, okay, I'm taking away your A, Satan. Okay. You say what God says.
Right.
Flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. Then get behind me, Satan. And we think, well, dunderhead, you said he's the Christ.
Right.
Why are you arguing with him? And the answer would be, he said he's the Christ. You don't rule by letting the bad guys kill you. You rule by kicking the bad guys until they stop doing bad things.
Right.
Kings, Christ means king. Anointed one signifies the king. Christ means anointed one. So you're the king. You can't die. And, of course, Jesus doubles down on this and says, if you want to be my follower, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. So in the synoptics, you get multiple passion predictions, they're often called, where Jesus speaks explicitly, literally, about his death in a more and more elaborate way, always focused on Jerusalem, doctoral thesis, always focused on the Sanhedrin, the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law, or the scribes, always implicitly or explicitly involving the Romans. If you're handing someone over to be crucified, we know who you're handing them over to.
You're handing them over to somebody, right?
Right, yeah, and only Rome does the crucifying. So all of this is here, and in various ways we're hearing this with notes that the disciples don't understand. There's a place in Luke 18 where Luke says 3 different ways. They didn't understand. It was hidden from them, and they didn't understand. They don't get it. With all of the hard sayings Jesus is using, this is an easy one. It's right there, and they miss it because it makes no sense.
Right.
It just does not compute. So when we see all of these kinds of things, this helps us understand then why, when you get to what we typically mark as the beginning of the Passion narrative, which is Palm Sunday.
Right. Jesus
tells his disciples, go to such and such a place. You'll find a colt of a donkey. The keys are in it. Take it. And if anyone says, if it's a Dodge, right? Ha ha.
Right.
And if anyone says, why are you taking that? You just say, the master needs it.
Right.
And they'll be cool. And so they go, and it says, and they found it just as he said. Mm-hmm. So this is again a foreshadowy kind of thing. If Jesus knows where the available donkeys are,
right,
how much more does he know what his enemies are plotting? Okay?
Right.
So then we come to, as we go, Jesus comes into Jerusalem. He is hailed as king.
Right.
And everyone is saying words from the 118th Psalm.
Psalm 118, right.
I think you guys did a thing on the Psalms of Ascent or something, didn't you?
Yeah, we did. We talked about Psalm 118 a little bit, yeah.
Okay, well, that's great. So your listeners know about the Psalms of Ascent.
Hosanna, and that kind of stuff, yeah.
Hosanna, blessed is he who comes. This is the king entering the temple.
Yep.
And Jesus enters the temple, and of course he acts with kingly authority in what he does, and specifically says, you have made it a den of leistai in Greek, which signifies not just people who steal things, but
violently,
rebels, rebels or insurrectionists,
Yeah.
more specifically.
Yeah.
When Jesus is later crucified, he is crucified with two lace tie, two
Right.
of these rebels. Again, not just even guys who steal and kill their victims. They are rebelling against Rome. This is why they're being crucified. So, but he's saying you've made it a den of robbers, quoting Jeremiah chapter 7, where Jeremiah is using this to solve the riddle. Well, how is God going to let Jerusalem fall when his temple is here? That'll put God's name in disrepute. And Jeremiah says, ain't his temple anymore.
Right.
You've made it a den of robbers.
Right.
So this leads then to the question the next day, by what authority do you do this? Well, first, Jesus famously refuses to answer because they won't say, what they think about John the Baptist's authority. He puts them on the horns of a dilemma. But then, in characteristic Jesus fashion, after he says, I won't answer you, he answers them. And he answers them in characteristic Jesus fashion with a parable. And the parable is, in characteristic Jesus fashion, a parable that's rooted in the Old Testament but brings a twist to a familiar story.
Right.
So Isaiah had told a story about a vineyard.
Vineyard, yep.
Isaiah 5, he strums his guitar and says, let me sing for my beloved the song of the vineyard. And it's a simple story. A man plants a vineyard. It doesn't bear fruit. What's he going to do? He's going to rip it up and replant it. And so this is Isaiah saying exile is coming because Israel is an unfruitful vineyard.
As we
Jesus takes that.
And we've just for our listeners, we mentioned
ahead.
before. Well, I'm just going to say vineyard, stands for Israel. I mean, that's a way to think about Israel. It's a symbolic way to talk about Israel.
It's not every vineyard refers to Israel. Sometimes a vineyard is just a vineyard. To
quote Sigmund Freud, right?
Exactly. And but this vineyard has got a history. But the story that Jesus tells is focused not on the fruitfulness of the vineyard, but on the faithfulness of those who are its tenants, and they refuse to pay the rent. And so then the vineyard owner says, I will send my son. They will respect my son. And they see the son coming and say the stupidest thing that anyone says in the Bible, which is, this is the heir. Let's kill him, and the vineyard will be ours.
Right.
Okay, just like Darwin Awards kind of thing. And you're supposed to hear the stupidity in that. And then Jesus says to the crowd, so what will the vineyard do with those guys? And he answers, well, get rid of them and give it to somebody else.
Right.
And then Jesus quotes, drum roll, the 118th Psalm.
Right.
The stone which the builders have rejected has become the chief stone.
Right.
In the context of the psalm, that's Israel, and even more specifically, Israel's king, rejected by the builders, that is the Gentile nations, because Israel is a weak, insignificant nation that nobody cares about. But now he's saying, well, I am Israel's king, and I'm rejected by the builders, but they be you, the leaders of the temple, the chief priests, the elders and the scribes, the Sanhedrin, the guys who run this show, the guys who have turned it into a den of robbers. Put 2 and 2 and 2 together and you get 6 here. And that is, who made it a den of robbers? The guys who run the joint. How have they made it a den of robbers? They want to kill God's son.
The rightful heir, right?
The heir is here. Let's kill him. He's a rival to their authority. And so they're ready to kill him. So all of this, he's basically calling the shot before they attempt it, as it were. So then we come into, there are, of course, other controversies there and so forth. We come to the point where we begin, again, narrowing in. If we begin the passion narrative a little bit later, it often comes with this story that we have in Matthew, Mark, and John. Interestingly, Luke doesn't have it, of Jesus anointing at Bethany, where he says that this anointing that Mary administers to him is preparation for his burial. And that he endorses this extravagant act in that way. Well, that story is closely connected then with Judas' agreement to, as we typically translate the term, betray Jesus.
Hand him over, literally. Yeah.
Literally hand him over. Very, very common word used about 500 times in the New Testament.
I learned that from somebody one time. I can't remember who. So.
Did you? Yeah. Well, unlike most, you remembered. Okay. and you can decide whether that's a blessing or a curse.
Or curse, right?
Yeah. Sometimes forgetfulness is a wonderful thing. But hand over. But years ago, I was reading the Damon Runyon Guys and Dolls stories. They're the basis for the Guys and Dolls musical. And on the side, I would say, when Lent is over and you can read something for fun again, listeners, if you haven't read the Damon Runyon Guys and Dolls stories, you should read them. They're hilarious. But in the language of these mid-century Broadway gangsters in New York in these books, Judas is going to finger Jesus.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Which means he's going to reveal where he is when he isn't in public and where he can be snatched.
Right.
Okay. So the dilemma of the Sanhedrin is that they can't arrest Jesus publicly because he's popular with the crowds, and this will create a riot. And the worst outcome for the Sanhedrin is that the riot is going to lead to the Romans saying, "We're done with you guys. We're going to get other guys." So they don't want to risk that. They're going to wait till after Passover. Then Judas comes for whatever motive, and the Gospels don't comment on Judas' motive except to imply in the Gospel of John that he likes money.
Right.
He goes and agrees to betray Jesus. That is, tell them where he is when he is away from the crowd. Now, the obvious place and time that you would be looking for would be the Passover feast. There is a night coming when the city is going to be shut down, the streets are going to be empty, everyone's going to be in a home observing the Passover feast after sundown. So
Right.
It's dark, it's quiet, and you're going to be able to pull this off. So what's interesting then is that when the question comes in the Synoptics, where do you want us to prepare the Passover? Jesus gives them this cloak and dagger explanation,
Right.
and it is that so go into the city, and you're going to find a man carrying water. Now, what's so unusual about that?
It's a man.
As we
carrying
all
water.
know, I mean, as all true godly people know, it's women's work to carry water.
At least in the first century, in Judea.
That's right. We can do another session on the ways that
we may need a trigger warning for this episode as well. So let's see.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, your ideas of masculinity and femininity are largely culturally determined. Okay. Anyway,
oh boy.
This is an unusual thing. I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
People are only going to listen to this point, and then they're going to turn it off,
Yeah.
and then
Call
they're
their
going to write to you, and they're going to block you. That's right.
No,
And-
but you're right.
gosh.
So it would be an unusual thing, something for them to point out to follow, right?
Yeah.
So-
And so nobody knows where they're going till they get there.
Right.
The guys who are preparing the meal, let me add, the guys who are preparing the meal
Right.
are going to this destination unknown.
Right.
And then everyone else goes there because Jesus knows where it is too. Well,
Right.
how does he know? Well, he knows stuff. He knows
Right.
stuff. He knew where the colt was parked. He knows where the Passover is going to be. He knows before he dies that he's going to die, and he knows how, and he knows who's going to do it. So we're in the upper room, and of course here now we begin. This is especially where we begin layering the Old Testament onto the events. Not that we aren't always layering the Old Testament onto the events of the Gospels, but of course this is Passover, and Passover is when we remember. The key word is remember.
Right.
How God, by His mighty hand, defeated the Egyptians, and even more importantly, the gods of the Egyptians with the plagues. All of the plagues famously are targeted at things that are sacred to the Egyptians.
Right.
And by his mighty hand, he brings this ragtag group of recalcitrant, stubborn, disobedient, enslaved people out of the greatest economic and military power of their region to date.
Right.
And so this is why we eat with our sandals on, our belt around our waist, our staff in our hand, and we're eating the same things that we ate then.
Right.
Unleavened bread. Don't have time for it to rise.
Yeah.
Okay. we're going through the drive-through and we're going to eat in the car. We are out of here. Okay, we are out of here. And of course, there's bitter herbs as well. And then there are other things that are added by tradition, all of which are supposed to remind us. And of course, the lamb. Critically, the lamb, which was sacrificed and the blood put on the doorposts, as was done at that time. Now, the remembering here then is remembering the victory of God on behalf of His helpless people, and the way that God shows Himself to be the true God and defeats the evil empire in this.
Right.
Now, and I always compare the significance of Passover to a Jewish person, probably in any point of history. I can't speak to that so much as to the Second Temple period, which I have a smattering of knowledge about. It maybe we ought to think of it in terms of its social importance along the lines of Thanksgiving and the turkey at Thanksgiving. So if you can imagine somebody at your Thanksgiving celebration standing up, pulling the drumstick off, and saying, "I want everybody to take a bite of this. From now on, this turkey is about me."
Right.
Okay. That's nuts.
Yeah.
You don't do that. No, dude, it's the pilgrims and
Right.
and thanks, and all. It's not about you. What a narcissist.
Right.
You just. But this is essentially what Jesus does.
Right.
Okay? He takes the elements of Passover, the bread, which is, the unleavened bread is central to the thing. The cup is very traditional,
Sure.
and has become a part of the tradition at this time. 3 cups go around the table, as far as we know, in this period, with a blessing. And so after that's done, Jesus takes the bread one more time, breaks it, and says, "This is my body broken for you." So we're getting Passover, and Jesus is making it refer to himself, but he's also using imagery that suggests sacrifice in the temple.
Right.
An animal, before it is placed on the altar, is cut into pieces. And so, the breaking of the bread is like the breaking of the body of the sacrificial animal. And then the cup, he says, this is the blood which is poured out for you. The blood of a sacrificial victim is caught in a basin. And
Right.
then as the sacrifice is placed on the altar, it's poured out in front of the altar. Leviticus uses this refrain, "The life is in the blood," to say you should see this as a symbol of the life of the animal being given in place of the life of the guilty person.
Right.
So Jesus is layering Passover and sacrificial imagery together. So now the remember is very different. And this is a memory like the Exodus. This isn't a memory like my sadness over my dead relatives, for example.
Right.
Because Jesus is not going to remain dead.
Right.
And I do. Should I, imagine myself in this situation and experience the grief of the crucifixion, understanding that Jesus is dying for my sins? I'm fine with that. I want my Ukrainian flag to show. I'm fine with that. But the remembering of the Last Supper and of the Lord's Supper is remember like you remember the Exodus. God has raised his mighty hand and has brought
Right.
his people out of captivity, and in doing that, he's defeated the evil empire.
Right.
Now, the irony of this is that he's going to defeat the evil empire by letting the evil empire crucify Jesus.
Right.
And crucifying is how Rome says we're in charge.
Right.
We have authority.
It's how they put down a rebellion or put down a. Yeah,
It is.
right.
It is. We have Romans left very little discussion of crucifixion. We probably discuss execution much more than they did in terms of the extant literature. It's just not a polite topic for conversation. But there's a first century Roman orator named Quintilian who says whenever we crucify people, we always choose the most prominent places.
Right.
Because this is done not because the punishment fits the crime, but we do it to make an example.
Yep.
So it's a public display that you can't get past Roman authority. So that whole thing is being reversed here. So there's triumph in what looks like the darkest hour. This is God's victory. He's taken the way we look at life and turned it upside down in that respect.
Right.
So this is leading up to all this. I'm going to keep going here.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions, Ryan? Keep going. No, it's good.
No, I'm letting it wash over me here.
Okay. Ooh, wash. Nice metaphor. Then we go to the garden. And in the midst of this, Jesus is saying, one of you will betray me.
Right.
Should mention that. And in the way that this is narrated, it's narrated very differently in each of the Gospels, but with enough overlap that we can say, yeah, it's a faithful memory of what went on in a complicated moment. No one thinks it's them. The King James Version, "Is it I?" doesn't quite capture what they ask. It's really saying, it isn't me, is it?
It's not me, is it? Right.
It's a question that anticipates a negative answer.
Right.
And when Judas asks that question, Jesus indicates that he knows what's going on. This happens in John. In the Synoptics, so we see Jesus' knowledge there. In the Synoptics, Jesus just says, "It's somebody who dipped in the bowl with me," which means it's just one of you. But along with this, he says, all of you are going to fall away. But then Matthew and Mark, but afterwards I will go before you to Galilee, and you will see me there, which is just absolutely critical. And Peter, of course, says, well, not me, I'll die with you. And we know how that goes as well. That before the rooster crows, and if you've been around poultry, you know that that's early and often, you will deny me 3 times. So, these classic stories that we know so well really fit into a very tightly woven narrative. Then where does Jesus go? He goes to the Mount of Olives, to an olive grove known as Gethsemane, which we are told in a couple of the narratives is a place he frequents.
Right.
So if he's trying not to be found, he's made a bad move. If he's ready to be found, he's made a good move. Of course, he prays that the cup would pass from him. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Again, this is an expression of Jesus' submission, which reminds me of the temptation narrative again.
Right.
We shouldn't understand that Jesus does not himself will to do this. He has, in Luke, in chapter 9, verse 51, he set his face steadfastly to go to Jerusalem. This is also his will, but Jesus doesn't want to die any more than any other human does. Let me say on the side here, I think it's very appropriate for us to avoid saying, well, this is the human side of Jesus. Jesus is all human. He's all human. He's also all divine. Right. And one doesn't cancel the other. So to jump way over to Hebrews, if he was tempted in every manner as we are, that means he has a similar reluctance to die. So then, of course, the disciples are sleeping, etc. And then Jesus says this crazy thing, arise, let us go. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. If we were reading any other story, that would sound like run away. But Jesus goes towards those who are going to arrest him.
Right.
Of course, he knows what Judas is doing when he, by prearranged signal, kisses him. A kiss is a sign of a close familial relationship. Or something held between friends who are as close as brothers. And Jesus reveals that he knows what's going on there. And then there's all kinds of hurly-burly. Peter takes out a sword and cuts off the ear of the priest in Luke. Very interesting. Okay, got to say this. Okay, this is going to get another group of people upset. In the upper room in Luke, Jesus says, "Remember when I sent you out and said, don't take a sandals or a staff. Now you need a sword." Okay. This is not Jesus saying, I'm about to die to bring the story of God to its climax, but let me first of all endorse the Second Amendment. Okay. That's not what's going on. Okay. Yes, I'm in favor of the Second Amendment. Okay, I am. But don't quote that here, please. Because, Peter pulls out his sword and says, shall we use it? And he cuts off the guy's ear. And Jesus says, knucklehead, heals the guy's ear. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Don't you know I've got 12 legions of angels? And legion is a fun word because it's a Latin word here in a Greek text. He's using a Roman word to say, these guys got nothing on me. Now, this group of people, these are probably temple guard soldiers. These are Jewish soldiers under the Sanhedrin. So Jesus taken there. In John's gospel, we've got this fabulous scene depicted there. Jesus says, who do you seek? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I am. Typically, I am he in translation, but it's just I am, which is a refrain in the Gospel of John where Jesus is, I won't say obliquely, but not loudly, but nevertheless clearly claiming divine identity and
Divinity,
authority.
right.
And these guys fall down. He just knocks them over by saying, "I am." And then the scene is repeated, and he says, "You can take me if you let them go,"
Right.
which is a kind of a prefiguring that his death is in place of their death, our
Right.
death, etc. So all of this stuff is leading us in a couple of directions. One is, as I said here, that Jesus is in complete control of this. Along with this, the idea that his death as an experience is just as fearsome as anyone's death would be. His suffering is just as fearsome as anyone's suffering would be. But that he remains in control with full knowledge through the whole situation. So we say his life is not taken from him. His life is given. He's not tricked.
Right.
He's not overwhelmed, etc. They think they're doing all of that. He's showing something different to all of that. And in this respect, he now stands very much alone. And then we're seeing how layers of the Old Testament are just being put on this story one after another.
Just before you go into that, let me just go back just to reiterate, make sure that it's just made clear. Again, I'm going to make very clear what you've said here, but the timing and the manner in which Jesus gives over his life is of his own choosing. All that stuff you said
exactly.
All that stuff you said before. He could get away with this if he wouldn't have to be arrested. He wouldn't have to, he knows how to, his knowledge is such that he can avoid the enemy when he wants to, avoid the people who are seeking
his knowledge
to kill him.
and his power.
Right.
He can just knock people over.
Right.
But he doesn't use. But when he does it, it's just a demonstration to say, see what I could do.
Sure.
He doesn't use his divine. Yeah.
So the whole thing of laying his life down, to use the Johannine phrase there, he is the one who chooses to lay it down and then take it up again. So,
no one takes it. I lay it down, I take it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
I just want to make that clear. So, what are you going to say, Ryan?
Well, I just thinking back to the thing about him in the garden, that the thing you're talking about is like it wasn't just his humanity, that he's fully human and fully divine, and that the anguish there, at least for I will say that I always think of it as his human side, but you see it as like it's both sides of this.
Yeah.
Sensing.
I always tell my students, don't say side and don't say part.
Because it's
whether you're talking about the incarnation or the Trinity. The
way
and that isn't just a clean up your speech thing.
It's important.
And it's important. It's important for us, partly so we embrace our own humanity fully.
Sure.
It is okay to be afraid to die.
Yeah.
Is that a sign of weakness? Well, yes, it is, but humans are weak. Okay. And what does that do? Well, that drives you to rely on God. Oh, that was what I was supposed to do. God didn't save me so I'd be strong. God saved me because I am weak.
Yeah.
I remain weak, but go ahead.
No, I was just saying, not to belabor the point, but what I will sometimes say when I'm teaching through this, or have someone say something like that, well, this is his human side or whatever, I'll say, I don't know how, when we think about Jesus as the divine human, I don't know a way to separate that. That is his nature. That's who he is.
Yeah.
And so to try to divide that or to parse it or whatever, I think is to misunderstand what's going on here. That he's the true.
Yeah, it is.
He's truly, to not to quote creeds or anything. Obviously, we're not about that. But he's truly God of God, and he's truly fully man. He is both.
Well, I'm totally cool with quoting the creeds where they get it right, and this is one of those places.
Right.
They say it better than I do. Yeah. And one of these days, you guys will have a historic theologian. Somebody who does a history of theology, and they can talk about the Chalcedonian controversies and how we get the Nestorians out of there and all of that kind of thing. But it's more than just kind of academic theology. I think it really does affect the way we understand ourselves and our relationship with God. Yeah. If we do this. Yeah.
Good.
So anyway, go ahead, Brian. Were you going to say something else there?
And no, I was just going to say, I mean, that's good clarification. I always believed he was fully God and fully man at the same time.
Sure.
But I think there is a tendency to want to like, oh, his frailty is only in his humanity. That we want to separate it out to understand it better.
Sure. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
not
at least
easy
from
to
our perspective.
understand for sure.
Yeah. Now, so maybe pick up at this point, just kind of thinking about the general gist of the narrative. The narratives of what we call Jesus trials are very complicated because Matthew and Mark show them in kind of the same way. Luke has his own variations, and John has his own variations.
Right.
But there are themes that run throughout these. One is that Jesus does nothing to make a defense. That when he speaks, which is rare, what he says doesn't help his cause whatsoever.
Right.
Another is that his accusers have nothing of which to accuse him, which is of substance.
Matthew makes that very clear. I mean, Matthew says they couldn't find anyone, and finally they find these people who are willing to say this thing. Well, he said he would if we destroyed the temple, he'd rebuild it in 3 days, kind of thing. So
and then even they couldn't agree.
Right.
And so in the Synoptics, you finally get this question: are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus responds in the affirmative. Now here, I think. That guy who wrote that thing, Darrell Bach, a number of years ago, wrote not one of the many books that he's written that people read, but one that is written for people who only read really weird books.
Right.
Where he points out that it isn't agreeing to the proposition that he is the Christ, the Son of God, that gets Jesus in trouble. We need to understand that in a Second Temple Jewish context, now this is not going to be the case post-resurrection for Christians, but in a Second Temple Jewish context, and when we say Second Temple, we mean in this period, after the exile until the destruction of the temple, the New Testament era, essentially. You don't say you're at the right. Or I'm sorry, that Son of God is another way of saying Israel's king.
Right.
So are you the Christ, the Son of God? That's just saying, do you think you're the promised king that God has sent? There are a lot of people, I mean not hundreds, but there are maybe dozens of people over the period of the first century who laid claim to that kind of thing, and not all of them attested to us, but you can put together a whole list from the Jewish literature that we have, and claiming that is not a crime. I mean, in a later generation, one of the biggest rabbis was famous for his endorsement of another person who claimed to be Messiah, which cause came to naught. It's what Jesus says after this that is going to be worthy of condemnation in light of, or in the eyes of the Sanhedrin, or something that they think they can make stick. He says, you will see the Son of Man at the right hand of God and coming on the clouds of heaven. Right hand of God in particular, Darrell Bach points out, ain't nobody at the right hand of God in Second Temple Jewish literature. And so that's the divine claim right there.
Right.
And this is why then he has blasphemed. He has identified himself too closely with God. Now, from here, and of course, is that blasphemy? It is if it's false.
If it's false, right.
Yeah. It's not if it's true.
Right.
So from there, the Sanhedrin doesn't have authority to execute. Now, later they will execute James, but I'm sorry, not James, but Stephen. But that's a lynching. That's not a legal execution. To do this legally, and they need legal cover because this is Passover. They need to get Roman cooperation, and so they need to make a charge before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. And of course, the Romans are not interested in a Jewish charge of blasphemy. And when they try to raise that, Pilate says, "Well, go try him by your own laws." So they make the case that he is stirring up insurrection against Rome, claiming that he is Christ. One of the things that I try to get folks to appreciate is that in the history of the Western Church's portrayal of Pilate, he's often portrayed as a kind of a philosopher, who is interested in matters of justice and so forth. This does not comport with what we know about Pilate from historical documents.
Historically.
Josephus, writing about the Roman governance of Judea long after the temple has fallen, and wanting not to say anything negative about Rome, but still wanting to explain to Romans why the many of the Jewish people rebelled against Rome, AD 66 to 70. He wants to make the point that a lot of the Judean governors were just terrible and provoked people in lots of ways. But Herod was the worst, as far as he's concerned. Just brutal, insensitive in all kinds of ways. So as we're reading this and we see Pilate saying, "Oh, I don't want to do this. He's innocent." It's the historical Pilate is probably not, committed to justice. The historical Pilate just wants to stick his thumb in the eye of the Sanhedrin because that's what he does. His and this comports well with the kind of cynical indifference of Pilate in John when Pilate asks, "Well, what is truth?
What is truth?" Yeah,
and so forth. So in the end, Pilate is constrained by the will of the crowd to have Jesus crucified. And here I think it's important to get some things in perspective historically. In literary terms, this is not especially important to the gospel writers, but historically, we shouldn't necessarily think of this as the same crowd that calls out, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Sometimes we think of the fickleness of the crowd, and I'm sure there were people who were turned. I think it's fair to infer that for the Sanhedrin, they want to get Jesus in Roman hands early enough that he can look defeated, and so lose face and standing with the crowds that support him. So all of that is very cogent. But when we think of how large this crowd is, they're in almost certainly in one of two venues. One is the fortress of Antonia, which is adjacent to the temple. It's a Roman fortress that they built next to the temple, so they could get up on top of their tower and look over the wall of the temple and see what was going on in the sacred space that they weren't allowed to enter. So imagine those guys up there with their binoculars watching you, that kind of thing. But the other space would be the courtyard of the palace of Herod the Great, which had been appropriated by the Romans as the residence of the Roman governor when he was in Jerusalem. Either of those places had courtyards, but those courtyards would only have been big enough to hold about 600 people. 600 is not a lot, but if you are the Roman governor, you are in a sensitive situation. You're the occupying army, and you are in Jerusalem because it's full of pilgrims for the feast, and you have enough of a military force that you could put down a small demonstration maybe, but not a big enough one that the size of your force is itself provocative during these holy days. I mean, those of us who lived through American military action in Afghanistan and Iraq know how military forces, however good intention they may be, just their presence is provocation, right? So imagine if you think that these guys are pagans and are trying to take over the city of God. So he's got maybe a few hundred soldiers. He's at the cohort level and would need several thousand if this thing got out of hand. So what he wants to avoid is rioting when the city is full of people and the passions are worked up. And so he accedes to what they're doing. But as the narrative continues, this is especially prominent in Luke. You realize not everyone is in favor of this. Jesus speaks to the daughters of Jerusalem who are weeping and beating their breasts. There are people who leave the crucifixion scene in Luke in mourning. The response to Jesus in the Gospels is always one of division. So in this as well, though, we've got something that I think is important in this trial with Pilate, and that is that Pilate multiple times says that Jesus is innocent. And this is important because, again, if you hear the story of Jesus in a Roman context, well, he was crucified. Obviously, he was a criminal. Well, what would it mean to you if a Roman official, albeit a corrupt one, says he's innocent? He crucifies him nevertheless. He doesn't care about justice, but he says he's innocent. He hasn't done anything worthy of death. We're kind of clearing some ground here for the hearing of this message.
And you're particularly talking about Luke here, and you mentioned earlier this idea of how this would fly in the Gentile world, how this idea of a crucified king would fly. So it makes an important part of that whole telling of the story, I think.
And so when you read in 1 Corinthians, Paul says the message of the cross is foolishness to Greeks and a stumbling block to Jews. This is it. From a Greek perspective, that's just dumb. Crucified people are losers. from a Jewish perspective, that's a stumbling block. God's king can't die.
Right.
There's
Especially
the idea.
in a way that's cursed in the Old Testament. The
Yes,
the idea
yes,
hung
because
on a tree.
you have this notion. I think it's in Deuteronomy 27, but I could be wrong about that. That there were certain victims of stoning, which in Deuteronomy are supposed to then, after their bodies are to be impaled on a tree,
Right.
as a very gruesome public message. But in this Second Temple period, there are lots of people, and this is reflected in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, who are interpreting that as crucifixion, that a crucifixion victim is under God's curse. And in particular, this one of the scrolls even suggests that is seen in some circles as the appropriate punishment. Crucifixion is the appropriate punishment for those who have betrayed the nation of Israel. So there may be even an impulse towards that in the reason why the Sanhedrin is seeking Jesus' death by crucifixion. But I think what is loud and clear is the Romans see crucifixion as the way that they show they have all the power, all the authority.
Right.
And essentially, God is saying, here's how I'm going to defeat the beastly kingdoms. The Son of Man in Daniel 7 is the one who defeats the beastly kingdoms. I'm going to defeat the beastly kingdoms by letting them do their worst to me, in this way.
So when we get to the actual what we technically think of as the suffering and the crucifixion, and what do we have here? What do you notice here?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that could be said. We could do a 7 last words things, which is always great. I love that stuff.
Right.
It's interesting to notice with that you've got 3 words in Luke, 3 words in John, and only 1 in Matthew and Mark, which is the same one. Yeah. And there's no overlap. I mean, none are except for the 1 in Matthew and Mark. There's no sharing here. So both Luke and John are with the 7 last, or with their each of their 3 of the 7. Right. They're bringing 2 things together. One is resonance of Jesus' death with the Psalms, and the other is Jesus' confidence in God, in his death. In Matthew and Mark, it's just the Psalms, and it's the worst of the Psalms. It's Psalm 22:1. Yeah. Now this is the way I often talk about this with my students.
So you might want to go ahead and tell them. Are you going to tell them the line that Matthew and Mark share? It might be good so we can start thinking about it.
My God, why have you forsaken me? Yeah.
So in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani is that's what's misheard and misunderstood.
Yeah, and of course everybody's misunderstanding everything. This is right. So he's calling on Elijah.
Right.
Let's see if Elijah is here. Now, one of the ways I describe what's going on here is to say, imagine that this is a movie, and there's a score. Right. And the score is music that you recognize. Right. So you could have the same film presentation of the death of Jesus and offer different interpretations of it depending on the music that's playing. Right. You could play Amazing Grace, Nearer My God to Thee, or I don't know. Or you could play It's the End of the World as We Know It and I Feel Fine. Right. And you're applying, that's the score is there to tell the audience what to think about what they see on the screen.
How to interpret it, right?
Yeah. So in the Gospels, you don't have a score, but you do have allusions and quotations to the familiar texts of the Old Testament. So one set of familiar texts is the Psalms of the Righteous Sufferer, or Psalms of Complaint. I love the Bible because it tells us we can complain to God, and about 20% of the Psalms are like this. And so several of these are quoted or alluded to. Psalm 31, there's another one, but Psalm 22 is by far and away the most important. So much so that as Christians we read that as a messianic prophecy and think of it as predictive. Well, it is a messianic prophecy, but not, and I suppose it is in the big picture predictive, but remember, you're singing this in the temple and in the synagogue, and it's about you. This is how you use this. This is the way you see your own suffering. So what all of these Psalms are doing is saying, you see what's happening here. Jesus is suffering with the suffering righteous, as the righteous people of God, not that they're, not the perfect people of God, but those who belong to God, have always suffered in the world at the hands of evildoers. Right. Jesus is taking that on with himself, and that's something I think we don't always hear. The other big text here in the score, as it were, is Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. And here's where we see what we think of as the penal substitutionary atonement, if I may use all of those terms, and lose other listeners.
No, we've had a whole. I was going to actually ask you about this. We had a whole episode on the atonement, but go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I know. And all the atonement theories are good. Okay, they're like spokes out of a wheel.
Right.
But the hub is substitution. Okay.
All right.
And they all make sense if you start with that. If they don't, it's like what? Anyway. But that's systematic theology. I'm practicing without a license. In terms of the narrative, Isaiah 53 is all over this. Silent before his accusers. We turned our faces from him. He's numbered with the criminals, yet with a rich man in his death. All of these. Again, we read this as prediction. It is, but this is also expressive of this idea in Isaiah. How is Israel going to be light to the nations when Israel is sinful? And the answer is, well, God will use one in Israel who is innocent, who will be rejected, but who will die for the sins of his enemies. And then God will give him his life back again. So this is how in the telling of the story this is all being narrated. And then we're seeing other stuff going on, like Jesus is being taunted. He saved others, let him save himself. If you are the Son of God, if you're the Christ, come down from the cross, which is just like what the devil says back in the temptation.
Right.
And he doesn't do it. He doesn't do it because that's not how he rolls, and he can't do what he's doing if he does that. He is the Christ, and that's why he won't come down. That's why he won't come down.
And that's picked up in Psalm 22 too as well. I mean, echo of Psalm 22.
Yes. Oh yeah, the
there.
Mocking. Yeah, the
Sure.
mocking is there. They wag their heads and all. And one of the things I say to students, if I were being crucified, would I care what's happening to my stylish zip-up cardigan? I don't think so.
Right.
Yet we're told to gamble for Jesus' clothing. Why are we told that? We're told that so that's what we read in Psalm 22.
22.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, of all the crazy details to give, we're given that one.
Right.
We're given that one. One other thing then that I want to mention about this, and maybe should we say something about the resurrection?
Sure, maybe.
Okay,
that's actually a later episode, but yeah, go ahead if you want to.
Okay, well, I'll make just two remarks about the resurrection. Okay,
right.
The thousands, because we're probably fabulously over time.
We'll make it like Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, where it's just kind of an afterthought. The resurrection is just kind of there tacked on the end.
Oh my God!
He was hoping for a sequel. I don't think he got it. He was hoping for a sequel. We should devote an episode to that movie sometime. Okay,
that'd be interesting. That'd be interesting.
What's great about that movie, and what's and how that movie is really Braveheart meets. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, I was going to ask before we started this episode where Satan has got the little baby grown out of him. Like, was that in the Bible somewhere? Don't you remember this?
Why do people think I know what Satan looks like?
Yeah, that's not. But I do like the snake.
There was a
weird
scene in there.
Oh, the snake was great. Yeah. So in Luke, you get this statement: "I will not eat, I will not drink until new with you in the kingdom." Now, to the numbskull disciples who don't understand what's going on, that sounds like tomorrow we feast in the kingdom, because there are 7 days of feasting following Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So if the next time we have bread and cup, it's in God's kingdom, that's tomorrow, bro. Okay. Well, interestingly, even when Jesus is offered something to drink on the cross, he refuses it. Okay. Now, in Luke, when you get to the resurrection, where does he reveal himself to his disciples?
At the table, Emmaus,
with the
Luke
bread.
24.
Yeah. And then when he goes back to Jerusalem, they think it's a ghost, and he says, "Do you have anything to eat?"
Right.
And they give him a fish.
Interesting.
And he eats it. Okay, I'm hearing. Of course, I've got a hyperactive imagination, but I'm hearing a literary thing going on there. Okay, a way of linking that. Now, the other thing, again, because I'm a Lukeologist, Luke has Jesus saying to the two on the road to Emmaus and to the disciples, it is the entirety of Israel's scriptures which are being fulfilled here. Okay, It isn't just the 450 messianic prophecies that we box up and check off. It's the entire story. And I think this way of thinking about it through the lens of these selected texts, how can that be the entire story? God has always done his thing through weakness and lowliness. His people are always weak and lowly. And now he has taken that on himself. He suffers with us. God has always said, I will give the solution to your sin problem, and it's going to come through an atoning sacrifice.
Right.
And Isaiah is anticipating that. Isaiah is kind of layering on Israel's vocation to bring light to the Gentiles with this idea together. And now all this is coming to fruition. So wherever I look in the Old Testament, I'm looking at an epic story that is preparing me for this. And now with this, God is taking his world back.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on one thing because we talked about this before, and I know what you're saying there when you talk about this vocation, Israel's vocation. This is what God has always said: is his people are going to be the ones who are essentially his priests. They're going to be the intercessors between him and the rest of the world, and that's Israel in the Old Testament. Well, they fail. They failed to do that. They
God knows they're going to do that. It's just not a surprise.
Right. And they failed to do this, but then Jesus takes that up and fulfills it, does it correctly, does it the way it was supposed to be done, and then empowers his followers to continue that work of that. And so when we talk about that vocation, I know that I just wanted to clarify that's your shorthand way of saying this idea of being the messengers to the entire world of what God is doing and what God has done. So
one way of describing the dilemma of the Old Testament is how can the God of this little no-count tribe be the creator and Lord of the world? And the answer is he's taken his world back through them, and more specifically through one of them.
Right.
And then through those who are in his name empowered by his Spirit.
Very cool. So let me ask you, John, if you was there anything else you wanted to add just in your whole? I mean, I know you could say more.
Don't invite me, bro. I'll think of something.
That's good. It's all good stuff. Here's the very specific question. So, if you were really for our listeners, just a couple things. Easter Sunday's coming up. And as we're reflecting on the sacrifice of Jesus, the death on the cross, the burial, the resurrection, what would you want to be primary and utmost in our minds as worshipers, as followers of Jesus? What do you think is the most important thing that we could take away?
Yeah, let's name 6 or 7 important things. Okay. I would.
Why didn't you do 2 when you could do 6 or 7? Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah.
I would underline first of all this as I say sometimes to students who know grammar, the 2 prepositions. He suffers with us. He dies for us.
Okay.
With us, for us. I think we're in most churches of my acquaintance, we're very familiar with the for us. I think sometimes we miss the with us. I think some traditions other than the Protestant tradition are better with that side of things. Jesus knows what it is to hurt.
Right.
Years ago, I won't go into the details, but I was in just a spontaneous service that was held because a member of a community of Christians lost her baby in a terrible accident.
Right.
And the next day, a group of people gathered. I was in charge of putting the service together on the fly, and I said to one of the women who were part of this group, could you pray? She said, I don't know if I can do it. And I said, we need to hear a mother's voice today. And she did, and it was marvelous. And she began by saying, Lord God the Father, we know that you know what it's like to lose a child. So I just think this is huge.
Right.
So suffers with us is important. Dies for us is at the center of everything. Sure. Now, should this make us sad? Not for long. Okay, because the remembrance that we're called to is a remembrance of God's victory.
Right.
And the victory comes through the whole thing. Here's a theme we didn't pick up on, and I've got a bunch of students saying, I just took a midterm and I wrote an essay on this. Jesus' death is depicted as his enthronement.
Right.
As well.
John, I mean, that's, the lifting up is right.
Yeah,
The
but
lifting up is the
it's in
glory.
all of them.
Right,
One on
true.
his right, one on his left. In Matthew
Yeah.
and Mark, that was what James and John wanted. They see that as
Right.
enthronement. And that expression isn't used again until you get to the cross. Not an
Interesting.
accident.
That's very
You know,
interesting. Yeah,
King
do you
of the
want it now,
Jews,
boys?
It's just laden.
Yeah, James and John, how do you like it now? Yeah. So that's good.
Yeah, exactly. Can you drink of the cup? Oh, sure.
Yeah.
We get all of that. So, but what we want to say about this is God's victory, and so we embrace that not only with an eye to the resurrection, but with an understanding that this is, since you've used the word since you've explained the word vocation,
Yeah.
this is our vocation. Our
Right.
vocation is to live in a similar posture of lowliness and service towards others.
Right.
Carrying your own cross will not mean martyrdom for very many people. It will mean an awful lot of listening, a lot of giving, a lot of serving, a lot of putting yourself out
Right.
in a lot of big and small ways. And this is how the light of God shows in the world. In that very real way. So I tell my students, remember is like the remember of Passover. At your church where everybody's quiet and they play slow music, don't you go back as a sophomore and try to start the revolution all on one Sunday, okay? But if you want to look around and say, God sent his son and he died for all of us and he was raised from the dead and his spirit lives in us and that makes me feel really good, you do it, man, because
Right.
that's appropriate to do when you observe the Lord's Supper.
Right. That's good. I like that.
Very
So,
good.
well, thank you. Ryan, do you have any questions or anything?
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I don't have any questions. I love some of those connections that you were making between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that imagery that is subtle, and at least for us in our context, at least for me, it's these subtle connections and the interweaving of these narratives that we see throughout the Synoptics and John, that really paint this really rich picture of what's being accomplished. And that Jesus is, as you pointed out, that Jesus knows what he's stepping into. He knows where the donkey's parked. He knows where everything's happening. He knows how this plays out, and he's stepping into it. But that doesn't mean as he steps into it that there isn't the anguish for him as well and all that. But that there is reason to celebrate in the resurrection.
For all the literature people out there, it's all about plot and it's all about intertextuality. Yeah.
Right. Very good. Well, thank you, John. I appreciate it. Hope we have you back again
Thank you, guys.
sometime. It's always a pleasure to have you in the bistro. So,
Yeah, thanks so much, John.
I have a limited set of tricks, but we'll use them until we run out, and then we'll repeat them.
well, then we can get somebody else. But thank you very much. And we do,
Bye, guys.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you, and we'll talk to you again.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. You can find show notes, links, and more at thebiblebistro.com and find links there to follow us on social media. Next week, Brian and I are continuing our conversations about the crucifixion of Jesus. We will be discussing both the history and archaeology of it. We hope you'll join us for that. Thanks again for listening and sitting with us at the table in the bistro. We will be back Tuesday.